Welcome to Books and Beyond with That Guy Jay. I am your host, That Guy Jay. This is episode 3, and this is going to be my first solo podcast. No guest this week. I thought that we would just do a solo pod, and I wanted to let you guys know a little bit more about me. Specifically, the plan today is I'm going to go a little bit in depth about my ankle injury. I have mentioned the fact that I have an injury on here as well as TikTok, but I have never really told the whole story. So I figured I would do that today. The reason this story is important is I think ultimately this has led me down the path to even want to start this podcast. It's why this podcast has become so important to me. But before we get into that, I'm going to start with the same question I asked my first 2 guests, and this is going to be a question in every podcast. What am I currently reading? Right now, I'm trying to end the year very strong, and I've been reading a lot of novellas, and I've actually been reading a book today. The book for today is Of Mice and Men. I haven't read this book in many, many years, so I'm very excited to get into it. And then I think I'm going to also start throwing this into the beginning of every podcast, and that's Watch of the Day. Today's Watch of the Day is my Hamilton khaki Murph. Now, to get into my ankle. Why do I think that this matters, and why is it related to a podcast at all? The answer to that for me is really simple, and it's because this injury completely altered my life. This injury led me to a place where I didn't know what to do anymore. I lost all of the things that I previously had done, and 2024 has become my year of self-discovery and finding new passions and finding new things that I can love and care about and want to do in life. And that's why I decided to start this podcast. I want to deep dive into my own passions, and I want to include other people on this journey. I want to learn from other people. I want to learn about other people. I want to know what drives you. I want to know what people are passionate about, and I think that that could help me along this road. So the deal with my ankle is I have something called complex regional pain syndrome. This is a chronic pain condition, and it is usually caused by an injury, which was the case for me. It's similar in a lot of ways to nerve damage. It does have some differences, but it is a long-term persistent pain that is incurable, unfortunately. What this looks like for me is I have an excessive amount of painful numbness in my left foot and ankle, and I have a lot of swelling and just a lot of day-to-day pain. Standing for long periods makes this worse. Walking, of course, makes this worse. I'm not really able to walk unassisted. I use a cane, and at times I probably should use a crutch, but I'm stubborn and I don't. But we can go over all of that more as we go. I guess the best place to start with this is the beginning. In 2017, I was newly working for Geico as an auto damage adjuster. I worked in the field. So what this looked like for day-to-day life for me was I would drive around to different customer homes, or more likely than that, I would end up going to different body shops to write estimates for cars that had been in accidents. On the day of the injury, I went to visit a shop to see a car, and the shop manager wasn't there. I was actually perfectly fine with that because that meant I got to go meet up with my coworkers for lunch. It's a pretty uninteresting story. I don't get to have a cool injury story. I was just walking to my work vehicle, and I had my work phone out, and I was updating our app to indicate that I had been unable to see the car and that I had to reschedule with the shop manager. And I took a step off of the curb behind the car, and I didn't realize that there was a dip in the road. And my left ankle, to me, it just felt like it rolled, but it completely gave out. I would have fallen down if I had not been next to the car. I grabbed for the trunk and kind of like held myself up. And initially, it's not like I instantly knew something was wrong. I more looked around because, tripping and falling in public is embarrassing. And I was like, oh God, I hope no one saw me. And nobody did. But I just got in the car and I proceeded to drive back to our main shop where my coworkers were going to be. And I was trying to think about what we might grab for lunch that day. As I was driving there, my ankle was definitely starting to hurt a lot, and I knew that I had sprained it pretty bad, and I was not looking forward to the rest of the day because I had a couple more cars to go look at. And it was probably about a 15-minute drive back to the shop. And by the time I got to the shop and went to get out of the car, that's when I started to be concerned that something more serious might be going on. I limped my way into the shop and I sat down and I embarrassedly told my coworkers about it. And I decided to, pull my pant leg up. And instantly, even through my sock, I could tell that my ankle was tremendously swollen. I took my shoe off, took my sock off, took a quick look at it, and I quickly put the sock back on and the shoe back on because it was swelling so fast that I didn't know if I would be able to get my foot back into the shoe if I waited too long. I had only been at this job for about 6 months at this point, so I wasn't exactly sure what the protocol was, but one of my coworkers told me that I needed to contact the manager, who was then going to tell me to call an injury number that Geico had in place. And that's exactly what happened. I told him what was going on. He gave me the number I needed, and I called and basically spoke to a nurse. I told her what had happened. I told her what I was seeing, and she recommended that I immediately proceed to an emergency room. So from there, I quickly drove myself home because I lived not far from a hospital, and I left my car at home and I was able to get a ride to the emergency room. And that went about as you can expect, hours spent in a waiting room just waiting. I eventually saw a doctor. They did a quick x-ray and they told me that my ankle wasn't broken, and they sent me home with my ankle wrapped and on some crutches and told me to follow up with an orthopedic doctor. So that's exactly what I did. Now, this is where the story takes kind of a turn, and looking back, I probably should have handled it differently, but in the moment, I listened to the doctor and I just went along with what he said. The first time I saw the specialist, he took a look at it. He didn't even physically examine it. He didn't touch it. He just saw that the x-ray said it wasn't broken. He gave me a boot, told me it was a sprain, sent me on my way, and said he'd see me back in a couple weeks. I stayed off of it as I was supposed to. I was out of work now. I was unable to do my job on crutches. You can't really get around junkyards and tight body shops on crutches and in a boot. And I started to see this doctor almost weekly, and he kept telling me that it was a standard sprain, that it would be fine, it would get better. But after 6 weeks, the swelling hadn't gone down at all. The stability in my ankle was non existent, and the pain was still very much there. I asked him if there was any more imaging we could do. I asked him if we should maybe do an MRI, and reluctantly, he said that we could do that. It took about 3 or 4 weeks to even get an MRI scheduled, and I finally went and got it. And by the time that I went to the doctors to see the results, we were like 8 or 10 weeks past the injury date. The MRI revealed that I had an avulsion fracture in my ankle, which means that fragments at the end of the bone had snapped off. And I also had multiple partially torn ligaments and several fully torn tendons and ligaments. This doctor still proceeded to tell me that this was just a standard sprain and that I just needed to give it time and it would be fine. At this point, I asked for a second opinion. I was now dealing with workers' comp, so I had to wait for them to approve me seeing a second doctor, which they eventually did. And then I went to see the second doctor, and within 2 minutes, he told me that we were going to have to discuss surgical intervention. He explained to me that everything in my ankle was torn and that I needed a complete ankle reconstruction. This was obviously a lot to take in, so he gave me some time to think about it, and we discussed it at our next appointment. He explained to me that my ankle was never going to be the same, but he expected a full recovery in the sense of I wasn't going to have any issues. He told me I might not be running any marathons, but I would be walking and probably jogging without any issue. All of this, of course, took a lot of time. Again, workers' comp had to approve the surgery, and I had to go to see other doctors to make sure that this is what I needed. And this initial injury happened mid-March, and I ended up getting surgery at the very end of July of 2017. I went into the surgery expecting about a 2 or 3 hour procedure, and I woke up in recovery in the most pain I've ever been in my entire life. I've had multiple other surgeries before. I've had injuries, and I had never experienced anything like this. The surgery ended up taking about 5.5 hours, and when I finally saw the doctor, he explained to me that the damage internally was a lot worse than what they saw on the MRIs. I had torn cartilage. I tore more ligaments than they anticipated. The breaks were slightly worse. So what they ended up doing was actually drilling a hole in my bone and adding in a tendon from a cadaver while also repairing all of the ligaments and tendons internally, removing bone fractions. And technically, the surgery was a success. And at that time, I had no fear that I wasn't going to be okay. I was in a cast for, I believe, 3 or 4 weeks. And then they took me out of the cast and got me into like a knee high hard boot. And then within a couple weeks of that, I started down a very long path of physical therapy. The doctor did warn me that this was going to be a long recovery. He said that at best, this was going to be somewhere in probably the 8 to 10 month window for recovery. I knew I was going to have to work hard at this. I was on workers' comp at this point. Like I said, I was unable to do my job. So all I was doing was going to physical therapy 3 times a week, 4 times a week, whatever they wanted from me. And initially, I was progressing. Within a couple months, they actually had me off of crutches and I was just in the boot. And then eventually, they had me come out of the boot and I had to go back partially on crutches. And that's about the time that I plateaued. It just stopped improving. I wasn't getting any better. I was out of the boot, but I was walking with a cane. And that's where I stayed. I spent in total, I believe, 10 or 11 months in physical therapy. And it reached a point where they told me that there was nothing more that they could do for me. And that's where that ended. It was around this time that the doctor started to acknowledge that my pain level was not normal. And he sent me to a pain management doctor. And this is where the story for me got really unfortunate. And this is around the time that I realized that this was a forever injury. The pain management doctor tried injections in the ankle, and then eventually we progressed to a point where we were trying spinal injections. I did 3 rounds of spinal injections, which are extremely painful, and I had almost no relief. And at that point, the pain management doctor told me that he couldn't, in good conscience, continuing to poke my spine with long needles without me having any relief. And he told me that there was nothing more that he could do. And it was in this same time frame that my surgeon explained to me that I very likely had something called CRPS, which is complex regional pain syndrome. This CRPS diagnosis was echoed by the countless workers' comp doctors I had to see, because at this point, workers' comp was tired of paying me. They wanted me off of workers' comp. I had to see countless doctors, and they all agreed, and they all said the same thing. They said, unfortunately, there's no treatment beyond what you've had for this, and this is going to become a forever chronic pain issue. It took another few months to settle up with workers' comp, and then about 14 to 16 months after the injury, I was officially let go from my job and my new career was gone. I was mostly limited to bed. I could walk, but it was very painful, as it is still to this day. The swelling was even worse back then. And it was around this time that I slipped into a pretty severe and long lasting depression. I spent years really unsure where to go next. You know, all of the jobs I've ever worked have had some physical component to them. I've never really had a white collar office job before. I really had no clue what I was going to do. And I was also having to come to terms with the fact that any physical activity that I used to enjoy doing, I could no longer do. And my favorite activity was simply walking around, especially in the city. I live just outside of New York City. I spent years living in the city, and I absolutely love New York. It is my favorite place in the world. And I also had to come to terms with the fact that I could no longer enjoy this city that I love in the same way. I couldn't just go hop on the subway and go wander around new neighborhoods. I had to think about everywhere I was going to know whether there was an elevator or not. It completely changed how I lived my life. I spent a lot more time in bed. I spent a lot more time alone. I spent a lot of time angry, not sure what to do, some days feeling sorry for myself. I was very lost. And then the pandemic happened and everybody was stuck at home. So I felt less lost then because we were all in the same boat in that sense. But I still had no career path. I was doing online side hustles where I could. I did a lot of reselling on eBay. I've had an Amazon store over the years. mostly selling media, books, DVDs, things like that. And I've always just tried to scrape by as best as I can. And it's always been hard. This has been a very long road for me. It's taken me 6 years to accept the fact that I do have a disability. I will never be able to do the things that I previously did. And pain is just a constant part of my life. It wakes me up some nights. It's there every morning when I get out of bed. And it's something that I've had to learn to deal with. And I'm still learning. Tomorrow, I'm actually going to the doctor and I'm going to get a handicap placard for the first time in 7 years. There's always been part of me that didn't want to admit that this was my reality. So I didn't take that final step. But about 7 or 8 months ago, I kind of had enough with feeling the way I was feeling. I decided that I needed to figure this out. I needed to find a new path. I realized that I had no passion for life. I had no passion for anything. I was fairly bitter and kind of jaded, and I wanted to love things again. And one of the big things that I had been doing over the last couple of years that I realized had become my biggest hobby was reading. All throughout my adult life, I have been a fairly avid reader. But since I discovered Book Talk in 2022, I didn't post. I was just a long time lurker. But seeing everybody's TBRs and hearing about all these books that I'd never heard of, it reawakened my love for reading and I dove headfirst into the books. Reading has become a fantastic distractor on painful days. I can just disappear into a fantasy world and try and forget that I'm hurting. But more than that, Book Talk has reminded me that community is possible. Book Talk has been one of the best communities I've ever been a part of. There's so much kindness and so much support and so many fantastic people in that community. And I saw people share other things that they're passionate about outside of reading. And I wanted to, I wanted to join that. I wanted to be part of that. I wanted to have passions again. So I started exploring things that I can do, hobbies that I can do in bed or hobbies that I can do seated. And I found some stuff I like and I've tried some things I didn't stick with. And I'm definitely still on this road. I found that something that I enjoy far more than I ever anticipated is actual content making. I really enjoy making TikToks. More than filming TikToks, I like editing TikToks, and that's why I'm trying longer form things as well. I'd like to learn how to edit better. I'd like to learn how to make better videos. And this podcast has become the place for all of these things to come together. And I want to talk to indie authors. I would like to learn more about their journey and I want to learn more about writing. I've never written very much. I'd like to know more about it. And Book Talk is such a diverse place with so many different personalities and people and stories. I would love to learn more about what everyone else is passionate about. So while I've already had a couple of episodes and I already had a couple of great guests, I thought my first solo podcast would be well spent just letting you in a little bit more and getting to know me in this sense and sharing this injury, which I don't often do. I don't love talking about it. It's not something I enjoy, but I thought this might give you a little bit of a window into who I am and why I'm here, why this podcast even exists. I don't think if I had never gotten injured, I don't think I would have found content creation and I don't think I would have found podcasting and I don't think I would have ever been down this road of self-discovery in quite the same way because I didn't have to. I had a job and I had hobbies and I had things that I always did that I could do. I'm kind of having to relearn who I am and I'm having to adapt to a new version of myself. I think that's the long and short of the injury. I'm sure I missed some things. If there's any questions in the comments, I'm more than happy to answer them. I never expected to live with chronic pain. It's changed who I am. It's changed how I see a lot of things in the world. Some days are difficult. Some days I don't leave my bed and the depression and the anger over this is it's not gone. It's better. It still creeps in every now and then. I think that's pretty normal. And I just do my best. But through finding community in general and the book talk community specifically, I have found I have found a desire to want to try new things and to be a passionate person again. And I don't know exactly where that'll lead me, but I hope that you'll come along for the ride and maybe you can learn something about your own passions or hobbies and maybe you can share it with all of us as well. I'd like this to be a mutual space for inspiration, and I'd like this to become its own community if that's possible. Next week, I'm looking into having a couple guests on. I'm not sure if anyone will be available for that specific date, but I hope so. If not, it'll be me here again, and maybe we can dive into one of my current passions. I've been thinking of talking a little bit more about watches. I do my weekly Watch Wednesday on TikTok, but there's some longer form stuff that I could say about that. But if you've made it this far, know that I truly appreciate your support. The response to the first couple episodes has been amazing. I have had some really encouraging comments that have really made my day. And I appreciate the book talk community so much. And I hope to carry that over to here. If you could do me a favor and just like, comment, subscribe, or even review if you're listening on one of the podcasting platforms, it goes a long way if you could rate it 5 stars. But that's all I've got for this week. Thank you so much for stopping by Books and Beyond with That Guy Jay, and I'll talk to you next week.